China is currently experiencing turmoil. Hundreds of demonstrations have broken out throughout Chinese cities over the weekend in an unprecedented surge of civil disobedience as concerns with the government's harsh COVID rules boil over. But what does it mean for the economy and the reign of Xi Jinping? In this video, we will discuss that and more. Frustrations with China's zero COVID policy have been building for some time. As the rest of the world returns to normality, China's people are still subjected to sudden cruel lockdowns of places ranging from small stores to entire counties, frequently with only a handful of cases. A bus taking people from Guizhou Quarantine Center at night crashed in September, killing 27 people. The death toll much outweighed the 2 COVID-related deaths reported by the province since the outbreak began. Thousands of employees at an Apple iPhone facility in Zhengzhou battled with riot police and tore down barriers, owing in part to COVID restrictions. Residents in lockdown areas also shared rumors and stories of suicide and other facilities they related to zero COVID enforcement, including an infant and a 3-year-old child. People's anger and distrust have developed in tandem with the number of incidents, despite authorities' efforts to control information and criticism. A fire in a high-rise apartment complex in Urumqi, China's Xinjiang province, killed 10 people on November 24th. The tragedy may not have made national news, except for the fact that Urumqi, like many other cities in China, had remained under lockdown for weeks. Immediately, internet users speculated that COVID-19 lockdown measures had stopped firemen from reaching the burning building or occupants from fleeing. People blamed the fatalities on the lockdown. Their rage was fueled by an official's answer, which appeared to blame the people for not saving themselves, as the city saw the first demonstrations. People in a plaza were seen on video chanting China's national anthem, which has the phrase, "Rise up, those who refuse to be slaves." Other tragedies have occurred in China as a result of the dynamic zero COVID-19 policy. A 3-year-old boy died because his father was unable to seek medical assistance. Another 5-month-old boy who suffered the same awful fate. Pregnant women and old men have died as a result of hospitals refusing to admit them unless they had a recent negative test. Each of these horrific occurrences provoked an outpouring of grief and rage on social media, which was promptly suppressed. The Urumqi fire, on the other hand, triggered a different reaction. Hundreds of people marched to the streets in cities around the country, including Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Chengdu, Chongqing, and Wuhan, to put an end to the zero COVID regulations. Their protests began with specific demands: "Let us out" of locked residences, concerns about price gouging during lockdown, and requests for China to join the rest of the maskless, freely roaming world. Crowds gathered in Shanghai on Middle Urumqi Road, named after Xinjiang's capital. Crowds screamed at the Chinese Communist Party and its leader, Xi Jinping, to resign in the face of grave danger. A wave of protest showing both sympathies with Urumqi and local dissatisfaction had extended to cities like Beijing, Shanghai, Chengdu, Wuhan, Laozhou, Nanjing, and dozens of university campuses. Meanwhile, blank sheets of paper have become a symbol to represent the increasing demonstrations. The ability to safely express opposition has been effectively abolished under Xi's autocratic control, and it is extremely dangerous. The white sheet papers are a reference to the suppression of free expression and widespread censorship. A protest at Beijing's renowned Tsinghua University began with a single student waving a single sheet outside the campus canteen. Staff removed it, but she remained in place according to reports, and was soon joined by dozens and eventually hundreds of others. Perhaps most troubling to Chinese Communist Party officials was the fact that the protests, while spontaneous and relatively loosely coordinated, had common symbolism, indicating that they were aware of and built on one another. Some protesters yelled phrases originally heard during a rare in-person demonstration on Beijing's Shitong Bridge just before the 20th Party Congress. "We want to eat, not take PCR tests. We want freedom, not restrictions." Many demonstrators carried blank pieces of paper in their marches, a strategy used in Hong Kong to call attention to censorship. Protesters in Beijing used a slogan that specifically referenced the Urumqi fire. "Today we are all Xinjiang people." Unspoken was the possibility that the chant was also a reference to the draconian surveillance and detention policies that have targeted Xinjiang's native Uyghurs for over 5 years. And this is why the current protests are so effective. Few believe victims of zero COVID policies are to fault for their own deaths, and pro-regime supporters who argue differently are ridiculed. Instead, almost everyone in China can foresee the same dreadful event befalling them or their loved ones through no fault of their own. Furthermore, the protests have damaged one of the CCP's favorite rationales, that all opposition is supported by hostile foreign forces. The CCP has used this narrative to discredit the 1989 pro-democracy movement, repeated ethnic demonstrations in Tibet and Xinjiang, and, most recently, the 2019 Hong Kong protests. It is simpler to accept the allegation when it is directed at the other. When it is used against you, you recognize it for what it is, a falsehood. Zero COVID has brought this truth to the attention of a large number of Chinese people. People have felt the state's heavy hand pressing down on their life and recognized they had no authority or redress in the face of mistreatment. And now, people demonstrating against zero COVID are facing new abuses. Dozens of arrests have been reported, but no official statistics are available. The Chinese media has been silent on the protests, preferring to pretend they don't exist, rather than giving them a signal boost by condemning them. Unknown numbers of demonstrators have been detained by police, including at least one international journalist. The BBC reported that its Shanghai-based cameraman, Edward Lawrence, was held and beaten before being released on the second night of protests in Shanghai. According to the BBC, the police merely said they kept him for his safety in case he caught COVID from the crowd. On a Sunday night in Beijing, two groups of demonstrators totaling at least 1,000 people gathered along the Chinese capital's Third Ring Road near the Liangma River and refused to disperse. Crowds gathered outside Tiananmen Square demanded democracy and the rule of law, while condemning dictatorships and personality cults. Observers say these protests are unlike anything they've seen in decades, maybe even back to the 1989 fatal crackdown on student gatherings in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. The fight against internet censorship is a modern component of these demonstrations. China's internet firewall and an army of information censors are extremely successful, but they may have exhausted people's patience. Citizens are playing cat and mouse with censors, coming up with inventive methods to share films and posts about the protests, show support, or criticize authorities. Protesters in Beijing demanded the restoration of free expression. Give back the movies. We want cinema freedom. We desire freedom of expression. Give us back our media, our journalism. Hundreds of thousands of spectators have gathered in Qatari stadiums to watch the World Cup while all of this is going on. Despite broadcasters' purposeful avoidance of crowd shots, the masses of tightly packed, maskless audiences have not gone overlooked by Chinese fans. Observers have remarked that Chinese broadcasters usually pre-censor foreign sporting events, avoiding crowd pictures in case someone is waving a politically sensitive flag or anything similar. But in the current environment, this practice is attracting a lot more attention and criticism. Protest-related hashtags and search subjects on Twitter were bombarded with irrelevant posts featuring tourism, advertising, and pornography, indicating an attempt to censor information that had spilled outside the firewall. Much information sharing has shifted away from public networks like Weibo and into more private and more difficult to control personal messaging platforms like WeChat. Protests are not unusual in China, but the volume and extent of these are unprecedented, and the demand, an end to tight zero COVID, is not something the administration is now ready to meet. China's zero COVID policy was extraordinarily effective in the early stages of the pandemic, but it has been called into question by the highly transmissible later varieties. There are also doubts regarding the efficacy of China's locally made vaccinations in comparison to international choices that the government has refused to import, and rates of complete immunization are lower than health experts would prefer, particularly among the elderly. There is widespread agreement that if the virus were allowed to spread among the 1.4 billion people, these variables, together with unequal access to treatment, would almost certainly result in a massive death toll. People have gotten irritated since there has been no plan to move away from the present playbook of lockdowns and travel restrictions. The focus is now on whether the protests will continue, or maybe escalate, throughout the week and how authorities will respond. Those recognized as demonstrators will very certainly face severe consequences. It is too early to predict how long the present demonstrations will endure, or whether they will result in long-term change. However, zero COVID has already had a significant influence on Chinese society by raising awareness of the injustices perpetrated by the Chinese government and the possibility for those injustices to fall on any citizen at any moment.